Hey everybody, the next project on the restoration of my 1966 Lincoln Continental is to pull the C6 transmission. I'm going to be pulling that transmission and converter, and the goal is to have that rebuilt. So let's get started. The first thing you're going to want to do is disconnect the battery. The battery in my car is already out, so I'm able to bypass that step. So the next thing we're going to do is remove the nut that secures the transmission filler tube to the manifold, located right here, which is held on with a 9/16 bolt. Next, you're going to want to get under the car, and first you're going to want to jack it up, get it underneath jack stand so you have enough room to be able to pull the transmission out when the time comes. Our car is already up on jack stand, so we're ready to move to the next step, which is to remove this reinforcement plate, which is just behind the transmission pan. And this reinforcement plate goes from the passenger side all the way to the driver's side. Each side is held on with 3 5/8 bolts, so we're going to pull off all 6 of those now. Next, get your drain pan ready because we're about to get ready to pull the transmission pan and drain all of the fluid. And the transmission pan is held on with a series of 17 bolts that go all the way around. Those are 1/2-inch bolts. And we're going to loosen all 17. And after we loosen those 17, we're then going to fully take out both driver and passenger side as well as the rear to allow it to drain out, as there is no transmission drain plug. Most of the transmission fluid is now drained, so we're now going to remove the 4 bolts in the front of the pan so that we can fully drain the rest of the fluid out. Great, the transmission pan is fully removed, fully drained, so we're now going to reattach the pan, and we're going to hold it in just with 4 of the bolts in each of the 4 corners. This view is from the front of the transmission here. As you can see, the transmission pan is back here. And we're now going to remove this cover. There's 2 1/2-inch bolts. This one is going to require using an open-end wrench because it's too close to the housing here. This we can use a socket. This will allow us to gain access to the converter so we can drain the fluid out of the converter as well. With the shield off, we now have access to the drain plug for the converter, which is being held in with a 7/16 bolt. However, as you try and loosen that, it's going to want to turn the motor over. So what I have done is I've now put a 15/16 socket on a 1/2-inch drive, and I have it wedged so that the motor will not turn, which will allow me to now be able to remove this converter drain plug. There are 2 drain plugs, so now in order to gain access to the second drain plug, I'm just going to turn over the motor by hand until I can get to that other drain plug. And there is the second drain plug. With the converter now drained, we're going to remove the nuts that hold the converter onto the flywheel. There's a total of 4 of them, and they're held on with a 9/16 nut. We will now rotate the engine 90 degrees to get to the next converter nut. As I was removing the second converter nut, it became stripped. I did try and use an extractor socket unsuccessfully. It stripped it more. So I'm now going to use a Dremel to Dremel it off, and let's get started on that now. With that second converter nut now off, we're going to rotate the engine 90 degrees so we can get off the third converter nut. Great. We can now rotate the engine one more time to get off the 4th and final converter nut. We're now back up top where we can fully remove that filler tube from the transmission. We're now going to remove the starter wire, which is held on with a 1/2-inch nut. Next, we're going to pull out the starter, which is held on with 3 bolts. There's 2 that you can see here, 1 up top that you can't see. We still need to access it from the bottom of the car instead of the top. It'll be a little bit of a struggle getting that top one, but we'll use a combination of both an open end wrench and a socket wrench to be able to get those 3 starter bolts off. We're going to stay on the passenger side of the car, and we're now going to remove both transmission lines. And you'll see here that the transmission line goes into a fitting into the transmission. So the transmission line itself, we're going to use a 5/8 wrench, and then the fitting, we're going to use a 3/4 inch wrench so that we can get both of these lines off. Next, you're going to want to get under the hood, and you'll see that the hard lines for the transmission come all the way up to these rubber lines, and they're held on with just the hose clamp. So we're going to take those off now so that the transmission lines can fully drop out of the car. With both the back and the front of the transmission lines removed, there's now, these lines are just being held in with this little bracket. So you can either take the bracket off, which it looks like it's held in with like a 1/2 inch or 9/16 bolt, or you can just snap these out of the bracket. I'm going to snap these out of the bracket now. No need to take the actual bracket off. We're now back on the passenger side of the car. Just behind the transmission pan, you'll see the diaphragm here. And there's a vacuum line connected to the diaphragm, and we're going to want to disconnect that now. Next, we're going to remove both the manual rod and the downshift rod. And it looks like the manual rod is held on with just a cotter pin, and the downshift rod is held on with a C-clip. So we're going to yank those off now. Staying on the driver's side, we're now going to remove the speedometer cable that is bolted into the extension housing on the transmission, and we're going to remove that with a 7/16 socket. If you are following along in the shop manual, it tells you to remove the splash shield for the manual and downshift control rod. I have already removed that splash shield due to an exhaust project I was doing about a month ago. So the next step now is to remove the lower bell crank bracket, and we're going to remove the lower bolt first, which is right here. We're going to fully remove that. Then we're just going to loosen the upper bolt so that the whole assembly can hang free. Next, we're now going to pry on this upper bell crank to pry it out of the converter housing, and we're going to let that hang as well. The next step is to remove the drive shaft. As you can see, we are looking at the output shaft of the transmission, which means that the drive shaft has already been removed. And I had removed it previously because I also have already removed the rear axle out of the car to get that rebuilt, so we can move to the next step now. Next up, we want to remove the 3 lowest bolts that bolt the converter housing to the engine block. So you'll see the one that we have here on the driver's side. So we're going to start with that one, and then we're going to move down to the passenger side, and we're going to remove these 2 as well. And those are held on with a 5/8 socket. So let's get started on that part of the project now. We're back at the rear of the transmission, and this time we're going to be working on the e-brake assembly. So the first thing that we're going to do is loosen the adjusting nut, which we're going to use an 11/16 socket on this side and an open end wrench to hold it on this side. After that, we will remove the return spring. Then we will remove the cables from the equalizer. After that, we can remove the equalizer from the transmission. We're now in the back of the transmission at the cross member, and we're going to remove these 2 nuts to remove the transmission mount from the cross member, and we're going to use an 11/16 socket. Well, we had just removed the nuts for the transmission mount. One thing I forgot to point out is that I do have the jack underneath the pan of the transmission. I have a towel over a piece of wood, a wood on top of the jack. That was to allow me to take some of the weight off the cross member, so I was able to remove these nuts. And then
You can now move forward and remove that cross member. We're now ready to remove the cross member, which is held on with a total of 6 bolts, 3 on this driver's side, 3 on the passenger side, and we're going to remove it with a 9/16 socket. And we're now over to the passenger side to remove these 3 bolts. Great, we can now start removing the cross member. Next up, I'm actually going to lower the transmission back down just a little bit to where it was before I raised it. I'm also going to remove these supports, and then we could jump underneath the hood and start removing the top bolts that hold the transmission onto the block. Okay, now time to remove the transmission supports, and they are held on with a 9/16 socket. And now to remove the transmission support on the passenger side. We can now start removing the remaining 5 bell housing bolts. I'm underneath the passenger side, and this one can be removed from underneath the passenger side. There's 1 that can be removed from underneath the driver's side, and 3 that can be removed while under the hood. And it will be using a combination of a 5/8 socket for the ones underneath and a 5/8 open end wrench for the ones up top. And here's the one on the driver's side that we were able to get from underneath.
A quick correction, there's only one that needs to be pulled from underneath, and that's on the passenger side. The one that I attempted to pull from the underneath of the driver's side, I actually ended up pulling out up top. So there are a total of 3 that are left, 2 that you could see here. 1 is already extremely loose, don't know why that is, but we're gonna pull both of those off with a 5/8 open end wrench now.
All right, we're now down to the last bell housing bolt, which is just below the head on the driver's side. One thing I noticed as I was taking out this last transmission bolt is this is the wiring for the neutral safety switch, which is down on the driver's side of the transmission. And I'm actually going to unplug these wires right now so that this transmission can fully come out. All right, everything is off the transmission. The transmission is off of the motor, or at least it's no longer bolted. And now we're going to try and pull the transmission back and lower it out of the car. All right, she is fully out of the car, and it's now ready to get sent down to the transmission shop to get both the converter and the transmission rebuilt.
All right, the transmission and converter is now out of the car. There is part of the process that did not get caught on video. If you notice that last part, as I was lowering the transmission down, it started to tilt down towards the passenger side. And it actually did that a little bit more aggressively than what was shown on the video. And the reason the rest of it wasn't shown on video is because I effectively had to get under there and bench press the transmission out from underneath the car. Not fun, but was able to get it done. And unfortunately, I didn't catch that outtake on video. But now we're going to take this down to the transmission shop to get rebuilt. So stay tuned for more content on the restoration of the 1966 Lincoln Continental Coupe. Thanks, guys.